I was sold to a Mafia. The bass pounded through my body, vibrating through the worn wooden floor of the club. The neon lights reflected off the glossy surfaces, casting harsh colors over the sea of sweaty, writhing bodies. Every night was the same. The dance floor was packed with people who didn't care who was watching, their clothes clinging to them, drinks in hand. Minds lost to the intoxicating mix of music, alcohol, and lust. For me, it was just another night at Inferno, the club where I worked as a stripper. The pay was decent enough to get by, and the tips were better if I flirted with the customers, just enough to keep them hooked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. "Jay, you're up next," called out Marcus, the club manager, his voice barely audible over the music. I nodded, slipping out of the back room where the other dancers were getting ready. My body was on autopilot at this point, moving through the motions without much thought. I had been stripping at Inferno for over a year now, and I had gotten used to the routine. Get on stage, make eye contact, give them what they want, and then get out before anyone could get too close. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, something heavy that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The usual crowd was there, but I noticed a group of men in the VIP section, their suits and sharp eyes setting them apart from the usual men. They weren't the usual type who frequented Inferno, and that alone put me on edge. I forced a smile as I walked toward the stage, the familiar feeling of eyes on me as I climbed up. The lights dimmed, and the music changed, a sultry beat taking over as I started to move. I let my body sway with the rhythm, hands gliding over my chest, down my sides, and hips moving in time with the pulse of the music. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the performance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched more intently than usual. My gaze flicked toward the VIP section, and that's when I saw him. A man with dark, slicked-back hair, a sharp jawline, and an air of cold authority. He wasn't like the other men in the club. His presence dominated the space, making him impossible to ignore. He leaned back in his seat, eyes locked on me, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. His stare was intense, piercing, and it made my skin crawl in a way I hadn't felt before. I tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, I couldn't escape his gaze. Every move I made felt like it was for him and him alone, and I hated how it made me feel vulnerable, exposed, like I was dancing not for the crowd, but for his approval. After my set, I hurried off the stage, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to get out of there, to leave before that man could approach me. Something about him set off alarm bells in my mind, and I didn't want to stick around to find out why. But as I made my way toward the back exit, Marcus stopped me. "Jay, wait," he said, his tone urgent. "There's someone who wants to meet you." I frowned, confused. "Who?" Marcus glanced over his shoulder, his face pale. "The man in the VIP section. He asked for you." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly who he meant. The man who had been watching me all night. I shook my head, trying to back away. "I'm off the clock, Marcus." "Tell him no. You don't understand," Marcus said, lowering his voice. "This guy, he's dangerous. You don't say no to someone like him." I hesitated, fear creeping up my spine. I had heard rumors about the kind of people who sometimes frequented Inferno. People with connections to the underworld, to organized crime. "Who is he?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus glanced around nervously before leaning in close. "His name is Viktor Kontovsky. He's a high-ranking member of the Morozov crime family." My heart sank. I had heard whispers about the Morozovs, about their ruthless tactics and the power they hold. "Marcus, please," I begged. "Don't make me do this." But Marcus's expression was stoic. "You don't have a choice. Jay, Victor wants to meet you, and you're going to have to go along with it." I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as Marcus led me to the VIP section. Viktor Kontovsky stood up, his eyes never leaving mine. As I approached, "Jay," he said, his voice low and smooth, "you're even more captivating up close." I forced a smile, trying to hide my fear. "Thank you, sir." Victor gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sit. Let's talk." I hesitated, but Marcus's warning glance kept me in check. I sat down, trying to maintain a neutral expression. Victor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. "I've been watching you. Jay, you have a certain spark. A spark that could be very useful to me." My mind was racing, trying to anticipate what he wanted from me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Victor smiled, revealing sharp teeth. "I think you know exactly what I mean. You see, Jay, I have a proposition for you, one that could change your life forever." I swallowed hard, sensing the weight of his words. "What kind of proposition?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. I want to buy you, he said, his voice dripping with menace. I want to own you, body and soul. My world went dark. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Buy me? I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. Yes, I'll pay top dollar for you. You'll be well taken care of, I assure you. I'll do anything to have you. I shook my head, trying to process what was happening. I'm not for sale, I spat, trying to sound braver than I felt. Victor chuckled, the sound sending shivers down my spine. Everyone has a price, Jay, and yours is about to get very expensive. Marcus's warning glance kept me from lashing out. I knew I had to tread carefully. What makes you think I'm interested? I asked, stalling for time. Victor leaned back in his chair, eyes never leaving mine. I know all about you, Jay. Your struggles, your debts, your secrets. You need money, and I need you. What does he mean by that? My mind raced as Victor pulled out a checkbook and scribbled a number on a check. The amount made my eyes widen. This is yours, Victor said, handing me the check, if you agree to work for me. Work for him? What did that even mean? What do you want me to do for you? I asked. Victor's smile grew wider. Oh, Jay, you'll find out soon enough. Let's just say, you'll be taking your performances to a whole new level. The implication sent a chill down my spine. I need time to think, I stalled. Victor's expression turned cold. You have an hour. After that, the offer expires, he said, as if I don't want it to expire. I'm only afraid of what he's going to do when the offer expires. With that, he stood up, dismissing me. Marcus ushered me out of the VIP section, his face pale. What have you gotten yourself into, Jay? He whispered. I shook my head, numb. I don't know. As I stumbled back to the dressing room, the check crumpled in my hand. I realized I had two options. 1. Take Victor's offer and risk everything, or 2. Refuse and face the consequences. Either way, my life would never be the same. I locked myself in the dressing room, staring at the check in my hand. The amount was staggering, enough to pay off my debts and start fresh. But at what cost? A knock on the door broke my thoughts. Jay, Victor's getting impatient, Marcus called out. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Marcus's expression was grim. What did he mean by taking my performances to a whole new level? I asked. Marcus hesitated. I don't know, Jay, but I do know Victor's not someone to mess with. He's ruthless. I nodded, determined. I'll tell him no. Marcus's eyes widened. Jay, think about this. You're not just risking your own life. You're putting others in danger too. I braced myself. I'll take that risk. As I walked back to the VIP section, Victor's gaze locked onto mine. His smile grew wider as I approached. Well, he asked, raising an eyebrow. I stretched my hand to hand him back his check. I refuse, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Victor's expression hardened. You're making a grave mistake, Jay. Suddenly, two men grabbed me, their grip on my arms firm. Change of heart, Jay? Victor asked, his voice dripping with menace. I struggled against the men's grip. Let me go. Victor chuckled. You're coming with me, Jay. One way or another. The men dragged me out of the club, into the dark night. I kicked and fought, but they were too strong. As we reached the alleyway, a black SUV screeched to a halt beside us. Victor opened the door, revealing a dimly lit interior. Get in, Jay, Victor ordered. I dug my heels into the ground and shook my head. Victor's eyes flashed with anger. You don't have a choice. I tried to resist, but Victor's men were too strong. They shoved me into the SUV, and Victor followed, slamming the door behind him. As the vehicle sped away from the club, Victor leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed on me. You're making a mistake, Jay, he said, his voice dripping with menace. You'll regret defying me. I glared at him, trying to hide my fear. I'll never regret saying no to you. Victor chuckled. We'll see about that. The SUV navigated through the city streets, eventually stopping at a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of town. Victor dragged me out of the vehicle, and I stumbled, my feet unsteady on the pavement. Welcome to your new home, Jay, Victor said, his smile twisted. I struggled against his grip, but he held me firm. As we entered the mansion, I caught sight of beautiful decorations and lavish furnishings. Victor's wealth was staggering, but I knew I wasn't here to admire the decor. What do you want from me? I demanded. Victor's eyes gleamed with excitement. I want to. He was cut off. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Victor, perhaps we should discuss. Victor's gaze snapped to the speaker, his expression darkening. Mind your own business, Jace. Jace's eyes locked onto mine, and I sensed a flicker of sympathy. But he nodded and retreated, disappearing into the shadows. Victor's attention returned to me. You'll learn to obey me, Jay, or suffer the consequences. I knew I had to escape, but for now, I was trapped. I was led to Victor's room by Victor. I was surprised because I thought I was going to be staying in some basement or locked up. Is this my room? I asked, trying not to gasp in awe at the room. Our room, he simply said. Shocked, I turned to him. I'm not staying in the same room with you. I folded my arms. Well, you don't have a choice. After hours of me refusing to get in bed, the exhaustion made me cave in. I lay stiffly in the lavish bed, Victor's warmth radiating beside me. His mansion was a cage, and I was his prized captive. Relax, Jay, Victor whispered, his breath tickling my ear. You're safe with me. Safe, I thought bitterly. Trapped was more like it. Victor's hand drifted to my shoulder, his touch sending shivers down my spine. Don't touch me, I snapped, shrugging him off, while moving farther away from him. Victor's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push the issue. For now. As the nights passed, Victor's behavior confused me. He'd be cruel one moment, then tender the next. Like the night he brought me dinner, feeding me himself as if I were a fragile bird. Or the evening he played piano, his music hauntingly beautiful. One moment, he'd be cold and calculating. The next, tender and affectionate. I struggled to understand him as I was unsure on how to react. This dinner was a prime example. Victor presented me with a sumptuous feast, each dish expertly prepared. Eat, he commanded, his eyes gleaming with intensity. I hesitated, but Victor's gaze wouldn't let me be. He fed me himself, each bite a sensual experience. Open, he whispered, his breath caressing my lips. My mouth parted, and Victor's fingers brushed against my tongue. A shiver coursed through me. You're so fragile, Victor murmured, his eyes burning with desire. I pushed him away, trying to clear my head. Stop this, Victor, but he merely smiled. Backing away, days blurred into nights, and I felt trapped in a twisted routine within Victor's mansion. Every attempt to break free failed. The guards were too vigilant, and Victor was always one step ahead. But there was something more troubling than the prison I found myself in. It was the way Victor's icy demeanor began to break, his walls cracking little by little. He also had moments of jealousy that startled me. Whenever Jace, his right-hand man, so much as spoke to me, Victor's expression darkened, his possessiveness taking hold. One evening, Jace brought me a book I'd mentioned wanting to read, placing it quietly on the table in my room. Thank you, I whispered, unsure of how to interact with anyone under Victor's watchful eye. But the moment Jace left, Victor stormed in. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold. Is he bothering you? Victor growled, taking my hand in a strong hold, his fingers gripping my wrist harder than necessary. I shook my head, eyes widened, confused by his anger. No, he was just giving me a book, I said while waving the book in front of him with my other hand. Good, Victor interrupted, pulling me closer. You're mine, Jay. No one touches what's mine. His voice was laced with a dangerous edge. But there was something else too, a flicker of vulnerability that he couldn't quite hide. I tried to pull away, but Victor wouldn't let me go, his grip tightening for a moment before he suddenly released me, his gaze softening just a fraction. I'm not your possession, I said, trying to sound defiant, but my voice wavered under the weight of the situation. For the first time, Victor didn't immediately snap back. Instead, he turned away, running a hand through his dark hair. His back was tense, shoulders rigid, as if he were holding something in. There was an unfamiliar hesitance in his movements, and it made me wonder what was going on behind those cold, calculating eyes. Later that night, Victor sat at the piano, the haunting melody filling the grand room. I watched from the shadows, trying to understand this man who had stolen my life but, somehow, seemed to be trapped by his own demons. When the music stopped, Victor looked over his shoulder at me, his expression unreadable. Do you hate me, Jay? The question caught me off guard. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to scream it at him, but something in the way he asked made the words catch in my throat. I don't know, I admitted, barely above a whisper. Victor stood up and walked over to me. He was so close now, close enough that I could see the tension in his face, the cracks in his facade. There's something you need to know, he said quietly, his voice low and serious. The reason I bought you, it wasn't just because I wanted you. I frowned, trying to understand what he was getting at. What do you mean? Victor's hand came up, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. A gesture so gentle it took me by surprise, but also reminded me that I needed a haircut. Someone else was planning to buy you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Someone far worse than me. You wouldn't have survived with him. He would have destroyed you. The air in the room grew heavy as his words sank in. Who? I asked, my heart pounding. Victor's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. Mikhail Volkov, he said the name like a curse. He wanted to buy you for reasons you don't want to imagine. I shuddered at the mention of the name. I had heard rumors of Volkov, cruel, ruthless, and dangerous even by underworld standards. Victor's jealousy and possessiveness suddenly made a twisted kind of sense. "You're safer with me," Victor added, almost pleading. "I can protect you. I will protect you." My head spun with confusion. I wanted to hate Victor, but now I didn't know how to feel. He had stolen me to save me. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of him lying. But all I saw was a man whose walls were slowly crumbling. Behind the dangerous exterior, there was someone else, who had risked a lot to keep me away from something far more sinister. "Why do you care?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why did you save me?" Victor's eyes met mine, and for the first time since I had met him, there was no trace of the cold, calculating crime lord. He looked almost human. "Because, Jay," he said softly, "I can't let anyone else have you." The days passed in a strange blur after Victor's confession. I couldn't shake the realization that I had been caught in a power play, a pawn between two ruthless men, one who had stolen me and another who had planned to destroy me. My feelings toward Victor were a mess of confusion and resentment, but his grip over my life had only tightened. I also noticed that Victor's jealousy continued to grow. Every time I interacted with Jace, Victor's scowl would darken, his possessiveness flaring. But instead of being cold or cruel, Victor's attitude shifted in subtle ways. He started doing things I didn't expect. One evening, Victor surprised me by cooking dinner himself. The sight of him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, moving with surprising ease, was jarring. He didn't say much, just worked quietly as I watched from across the marble countertop. "You can cook?" I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. He glanced at me, a faint smirk on his lips. "I wasn't always like this, you know. There was a time when I didn't have people doing everything for me." I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. "Hard to believe. What are you trying to do? Win me over with food now?" Victor didn't respond immediately. He kept his focus on the sizzling pan in front of him, but there was a slight tension in his shoulders. "I'm not trying to win you over," he finally said. "I'm trying to show you that I'm not the monster you think I am." I scoffed, my patience wearing thin. "You kidnapped me, Victor. You own me like I'm some object. So yeah, excuse me if I find it hard to believe that you're not a monster." Victor's face darkened, his hand gripping the spatula tightly. For a moment, I thought I had pushed him too far. But instead of snapping, he simply turned the heat off and placed the food on a plate. "You're right," he said quietly, sliding the plate across the counter to me. "But I'm still better than the alternative." I stared at the plate of food, my stomach in knots. The tension between us was unbearable. I didn't want to eat the meal he'd prepared, but the hunger gnawing at me won out in the end. I took a bite, and despite my resolve to stay angry, it was good. Surprisingly good. Victor watched me for a moment with a small smirk, then left the room without another word. I rolled my eyes as I quickly shoved the food down my throat. It wasn't long before things took a darker turn though. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a loud crash downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat, and before I could process what was happening, the door to my room burst open. Two masked men stormed in, grabbing me with ruthless force. "Let go of me," I screamed, struggling as they dragged me out of the room, but it was useless. Their grips were iron, and I had no chance against their strength. They shoved me into the back of a van, and within minutes, we were speeding away from Victor's mansion. Panic gripped me as I realized who must be behind this. Victor had warned me about Mikhail Volkov, and now his men had come for me. Hours passed in terrified silence as the van zoomed through the streets. When we finally stopped, I was yanked out and dragged into an estate. The place was colder, darker than Victor's mansion. An ominous sense of dread hung over it. I was thrown into a dimly lit room, the door locking behind me. I pounded on the door, screaming, but no one came. Minutes turned into hours, and the fear suffocated me. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling. The next day, I met Mikhail Volkov. He entered the room with a casual grace that covered up the danger he radiated. Tall, lean, with sharp features and eyes that gleamed with malice, Mikhail was the embodiment of everything Victor had warned me about. "Jay, isn't it?" he drawled, his voice like ice. He circled me slowly, inspecting me as if I were a prize he had finally acquired. "You caused quite the stir, you know. Victor was very keen on keeping you for himself. But ... here you are." I glared at him, fear turning into anger. "I'm not a thing you can just trade like property." Mikhail's cold smile widened. "Oh, but you are, darling. In my world, everything is a transaction." Victor knew that. I just offered a higher price. What does he mean? Did Victor give me up? I clenched my fists, my heart racing. What do you want from me? He stopped circling, leaning in close. I want to see Victor suffer. And you, my dear, are the perfect way to make that happen. Before I could respond, he straightened up and turned to leave, his voice echoing as he walked out the door. Make yourself comfortable. You'll be staying for a while. 3 days had passed in Volkov's estate. I had no idea what he had planned, but every interaction left me feeling more powerless. He'd always come to taunt me and say things he'd do if I don't submit to him. Things I can't even say. I was left weak and anxious every time someone would come in the room, hoping it was the other guy that always comes to bring me food as he regularly does and not Mikhail coming to do what he said he would. I couldn't help but think about Victor and how, despite everything, his presence had been preferable to this nightmare. Then, one night, it all changed. I was lying on the cold, hard bed when I heard commotion outside. Shouts, gunfire, the unmistakable sound of a struggle. I shot up, heart pounding. Moments later, the door to my room was kicked open, and there he was. Victor. His eyes blazed with fury as he stormed in, his usual composed demeanor nowhere to be found. Jay, he called out, reaching for me. I didn't hesitate. I ran to him, a mix of fear and relief flooding through me. He pulled me into his arms, his grip tight, as if he was afraid I'd slip away. We're leaving. Now, Victor growled, pulling me along as we navigated the chaos in Volkov's estate. His men had clearly taken over, and Volkov was nowhere in sight. When we finally reached the SUV waiting outside, Victor all but shoved me inside, again, slamming the door behind him. As we sped away, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins, I turned to him, my anger resurfacing. What the hell, Victor? You think rescuing me changes anything? You kidnapped me in the first place, I shouted, my voice shaking. Victor's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I told you, Jay, I saved you from something worse. I didn't ask for this. I shot back. I don't want your protection. I want my life back. Victor slammed his fist against the dashboard, the car swerving slightly. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I wanted this either? His outburst caught me off guard. His voice softened, the anger giving way to something almost desperate. I'm trying, Jay. I'm trying to make this right, but you don't understand what Volkov would have done to you. You'd be dead, or worse. I stared at him, my chest heaving, unable to find the words. I hated him for what he had done, but a part of me knew he wasn't lying about Volkov. I had seen enough of that man's cruelty to believe it. And what, Victor? I'm supposed to thank you now. Pretend everything's fine, I asked, my voice laced with bitterness. Victor glanced at me, his expression pained. No, but I won't stop fighting for you. Whether you like it or not, Jay, you're mine. I shook my head, the weight of it all crashing down on me. I don't want to be yours. Victor's eyes darkened, but there was a flicker of something else, something that looked dangerously like regret. I know, he whispered, but I can't let you go. Back at Victor's mansion, things were different. He hovered around me, always watching, always trying to win me over in small, subtle ways. He'd bring me books, sit with me while I read, even cook for me when I refused to eat. He was relentless, determined to break down the walls I had built around myself. But I wasn't giving in easily. I snapped at him, challenged him at every turn, refusing to let him think he had control over me. I talked back, pushed him away, and yet, there were moments when his persistence started to wear me down. One night, as we sat in silence after dinner, Victor looked at me, his voice quiet. I never wanted this, Jay, but I couldn't let Volkov take you. Not after everything. I met his gaze, my own resolve faltering. Why me, Victor? Why did it have to be me? Victor's expression softened, the hard edges of his personality fading. Because you're different. You make me feel something I haven't felt in a long time. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. And what's that? Victor's voice was barely a whisper. Human. For a moment, the tension between us shifted, and I saw the man beneath the armor, the man who, despite everything, was trying to win me over, even if he didn't know how. The days after Victor's rescue were far from peaceful. Mikhail Volkov, furious about losing his prized pawn, launched a relentless wave of attacks against Victor's empire. I could see the toll it was taking on Victor. His meetings with Jace and his men grew longer, more intense. One night, after another series of tense phone calls, Victor stormed into the living room, where I sat reading. His eyes were sharp, his jaw clenched, but there was a spark of triumph in his gaze. Volkov's done, he said, his voice cold with satisfaction. He's lost too many men, too much money. He won't be able to touch you or me anymore. I looked up at him, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. It was over. The threat that had loomed over me like a shadow for so long had been extinguished. I should have felt happy, or at least at ease, but all I felt was numb. What now? I asked, closing the book and standing up. What happens next? Victor's expression softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he seemed almost relaxed. Now, I take you out. I blinked, taken aback. Out, like outside. In public. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Yes, Jay, outside. You've been cooped up here long enough. I think it's time we have a proper date. A date. The idea of going on a date with Victor should have filled me with dread. But instead, I found myself excited, genuinely excited. I hadn't been outside the mansion since I was taken, and the thought of seeing the world again, of feeling some semblance of normalcy, was like a breath of fresh air. When? I asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of my voice. Victor's smile grew. Tomorrow night. Wear something nice. The next evening, I found myself staring at my reflection in the mirror, feeling a strange blend of anticipation and nervousness. I had chosen a simple dress shirt and some baggy pants, one that Victor had provided at some point, though I had never worn it. I headed downstairs, where Victor was waiting. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Victor's gaze met mine, and for a moment, his usual stern expression faltered. His eyes roved over me, dark and intense, and I could see the way his breath hitched. You look. He paused, searching for the right word. Stunning. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, hating the way his compliment made my heart race. Thanks. You don't look too bad yourself. And he didn't. Victor had traded his usual dark suits for something more casual but no less expensive, a tailored black jacket over a crisp white shirt, the top buttons undone just enough to give him a roguish air. He was still dangerous, still commanding, but there was a softness to him tonight that was new. Shall we? He asked, offering his arm. I hesitated for a moment, then looped my arm through his. Let's go. The restaurant Victor had chosen was an upscale, dimly lit place nestled in the heart of the city. As soon as we stepped inside, I felt a sense of wonder. It was beautiful. Candlelight flickered on every table, and soft jazz music played in the background. For a moment, it was easy to forget the circumstances that had brought us here. As we sat down, I couldn't help but smile. I can't believe we're actually out. I almost forgot what the city looked like. Victor watched me, his gaze softer than usual. You deserve to be out, Jay. You deserve to feel normal again. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to relax. The conversation flowed easily between us, much to my surprise. Victor wasn't the cold, calculating man I had grown used to. He was charming, almost attentive in a way I hadn't expected. I caught glimpses of the man he had once been, before the world had hardened him. Halfway through the meal, a young waiter came to our table to refill our wine glasses. He was tall, with boyish good looks and an easy smile that lingered a little too long on me. Is there anything else I can get for you tonight? The waiter asked, his eyes locked on mine. His tone was friendly, but there was something in his smile, a subtle flirtation, that made me shift uncomfortably in my seat. Before I could respond, Victor's entire demeanor changed. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and the air around him seemed to darken. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and dangerous. He's fine, Victor said, his tone leaving no room for argument. We don't need anything else. The waiter's smile faltered, and he quickly backed away, sensing the tension. I watched as Victor's gaze followed the man until he disappeared into the kitchen, his possessiveness unmistakable. Victor, I said softly, placing a hand on his arm. It's fine. He was just being polite. Victor's eyes flicked back to me, the intensity still there. Polite or not, no one flirts with you in front of me. I couldn't help but smile a little, despite the tension. You're being ridiculous. It's not like I'm interested in him. That's not the point, Victor muttered, his gaze softening slightly as he looked at me. I don't like anyone thinking they can have what's mine. I raised an eyebrow, leaning back in my seat. Possessive much? Victor didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned closer, his eyes locked onto mine with a dark intensity. When it comes to you, Jay, I am. And I won't apologize for that. There it was again, that raw, consuming need that seemed to drive Victor when it came to me. It scared me, but it also stirred something deep inside me, something I didn't want to admit. The rest of the meal continued without incident, but Victor remained on edge, his hand resting possessively on the back of my chair, as if to remind everyone in the room and maybe even me that I was his. Later that night, as we walked back to the car, Victor's hand found mine. The city lights glimmered above us, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. I had a good time, I said quietly, surprising even myself with how much I meant it. Victor glanced down at me, a rare, genuine smile tugging at his lips. So did I. As we got into the car and headed back to the mansion, I couldn't shake the strange sense of contentment that had settled over me. Victor was still dangerous, still possessive, but in that moment, I couldn't help but feel safe. The days after our first official date were a strange mixture of normalcy and awkward tension. Victor had proven, in his own intense way, that he was committed to keeping me in his life. There was something undeniably magnetic about him, a pull that I found harder and harder to resist the more time we spent together. But something had shifted after the night at the restaurant, something subtle, yet impossible to ignore. Victor was different, gentler. He still commanded the room with his presence, still walked with that air of confidence and power. But now there was a softness in his eyes when he looked at me, an almost shy hesitation in the way he spoke, as if he was afraid of pushing me too far. It was subtle at first, little things, like how he'd glance at me from the corner of his eye when he thought I wasn't looking, or how he'd pause before touching me, as though asking for permission without words. Even the way he asked me to sit with him had changed, his tone softer, more uncertain. One evening, as we sat in the mansion's grand living room, me curled up with a book and Victor silently reviewing documents, he suddenly broke the silence, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Jay," he began, clearing his throat, "I have been thinking." I looked up from my book, arching an eyebrow. Victor never hesitated. This was new. Thinking about what? He looked away, his jaw tight, as though struggling to find the right words. "I owe you an apology." Now that was unexpected. An apology? For what? For everything, Victor admitted, his voice low but sincere. "For keeping you here, for not giving you a choice. For all of it. You didn't deserve that." I blinked, momentarily thrown off by the vulnerability in his voice. Victor wasn't the type to apologize. In fact, I never imagined him capable of even acknowledging that he'd done something wrong. And yet, here he was, apologizing not just for one thing, but for everything. "I didn't expect that," I said softly, setting my book aside. "But, Victor, you didn't." "I did," he interrupted, his gaze finally meeting mine. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. "I've been trying to control you, to control everything around me, because that's all I know how to do. But you're not something I can control, Jay. And I don't want to anymore." I swallowed, feeling a lump form in my throat. His words, so raw and honest, hit me harder than I expected. "So what are you saying?" Victor exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair in a rare display of nervousness. "I'm saying I want to make it right. I don't want you to feel like a prisoner anymore. I want to give you your freedom back, Jay. I want to make up for lost time." He stood up then, walking over to the large windows that overlooked the city. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his shoulders tense. "I've kept you locked up in here for too long," he continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "And I know it's not enough to just apologize. I need to show you that I trust you, that I respect you." I watched him closely, my heart beating faster with every word he said. This was Victor cold, powerful Victor opening up to me in a way I never thought possible. It was almost cute, how uncertain he seemed. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, standing up and moving closer to him. He turned to face me, his expression soft but earnest. "I want to take you away, somewhere far from all of this. Just the two of us." I blinked, stunned. "You mean, like a trip?" He nodded. "Yes, a real trip. No bodyguards, no business, no distractions, just us. As an apology. I want to make things right, Jay." I didn't know what to say. The idea of leaving the mansion, of seeing the world again after being trapped for so long, sounded almost too good to be true. And yet, there was something in Victor's voice, in the way he looked at me, that made me believe him. "Where would we go?" I asked, curious. A faint smile tugged at Victor's lips, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of shyness in his expression. "Anywhere you want. Paris, Rome, the Maldives, you name it, and we'll go." I couldn't help but smile at the idea. The thought of traveling, of being somewhere new, somewhere beautiful was more tempting than I could have imagined. And the fact that Victor was willing to take me, to leave behind his empire and all the chaos for my sake, made it even more appealing. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Victor, true to his word, arranged everything. Private jets, luxury hotels, and even a carefully curated itinerary filled with sightseeing and relaxation. But despite all the extravagance, what surprised me most was how nervous he seemed. On the morning we were set to leave, I found Victor pacing in the hallway, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit, as always, but his usual confidence was replaced by something cuter. His hands fidgeted with his cufflinks, and every few moments, he glanced at his watch, as if he was worried about missing our flight. "Victor," I said, stifling a laugh. "Are you nervous?" He looked up, startled. "Nervous? No, I don't get nervous." Sure, I teased, walking over to him, "because it looks like you're having a mild panic attack." He scowled, though it was more playful than angry. "I just want everything to go perfectly. I've never done this before. Gone on vacation." I raised an eyebrow. "No," he muttered, looking away. "Taken someone like you on a vacation. I wanted to be special." For a moment, I just stared at him, unable to believe how endearing this whole situation was. Here was Victor, the man who could make an entire city bend to his will, worried about impressing me on a trip. "It'll be fine," I said, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm sure it'll be perfect." He looked down at me, his eyes softening as he let out a small sigh. "I hope so." Our first destination was Paris, the city of lights. When we landed, Victor's usual rigid demeanor seemed to melt away, replaced by something more relaxed, more human, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. As the weeks went on, we traveled to Rome, then the Maldives, each destination more breathtaking than the last. But what surprised me most wasn't the beauty of the places we visited. It was Victor himself. He had become softer, more thoughtful. The shy smiles, the small, almost awkward gestures of affection, the way he held my hand as we explored new cities. It was like seeing a whole new side of him. One evening, as we sat on a secluded beach in the Maldives, the sun setting over the horizon, Victor turned to me, his expression serious. "I know I've made mistakes," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. "But I want you to know. I care about you, Jay, more than I ever thought possible." I swallowed, feeling my heart race. "Victor, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted, his voice soft. "I just needed you to know." We sat in silence for a long moment, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the air. And for the first time since I had met Victor, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something that neither of us had planned for, but both of us were ready to embrace. The end.